Okay, so we're on to controllers and views, which brings us to our second Rails cookery. So we already kind of saw what do you have to do to add a new method, or to add a new model, excuse me, to a Rails app. The next logical question is, what do you have to do to add new controllers or new views? So to add a new controller action to a Rails app, you have to first make sure that there is a route that is going to eventually route to that action. If not, you have to create one in routes.rb. You have to add the actual code, in other words, the method in the appropriate controller file that will do whatever that action is. And you have to assure that there's something that the action can render when it's all done. From our question before, every trip through the controller has to end with returning something. And we'll see that although the most common thing is returning a view whose name matches the controller action, we can also return, in scare quotes, return other things. So as an example of this, we're going to walk through how you would do the show action and the corresponding view. If you read the book, it walks through how to do the index action in view, so I thought I would do a slightly different one in this lecture. So reviewing what the responsibilities are, if we're now going to add this controller action, what do models do? Well, they find and manipulate data. And we already saw a couple of examples of different methods that are provided by Active Record to help you do that. What's the controller's job? Well, the controller is supposed to get data from the model and make it available to the views. So we can imagine, hypothetically, let's write the code we wish we had. You're going to hear a lot of that phrase in the coming weeks. We can imagine that params, which is the parameters from the request that were helpfully parsed out for us by the routing subsystem, let's just assume that it's going to contain the ID of the movie we want to find, because then we could just call movie.find. Now, of course, this is unsafe, right? In a real app, you don't really want to do this, because if params ID happens to be a non-existent thing, we'll get an error. So in practice, we would either use find by ID, or we would rescue the exception. But for simplicity of exposition, I'm going to sort of gloss over that for now. So that's what the controller does. The instance variables, remember, that we set in the controller are going to be available to the view. So the view's job, it displays the data. It lets the user do some stuff. In this case, because we're doing the show method, it's going to be displaying the details of a movie, like a short description and the movie rating. And how do we know which view or what's going to happen for the rendering step? Well, unless we specifically say otherwise, the default action that Rails will take is it'll try to find a view whose directory name matches the name of the class and whose file name matches the name of the action, in this case show. So if we don't specify otherwise at the end of our controller method, once we fall out of this method, that's the next thing that's going to happen. And in a minute, we're going to see what some alternatives are if we wanted to do something different from that. So let's take a look at an example. Make it a little bit bigger. So again, you've seen some HAML before. This is pretty straightforward. This is what the show action might look like. Notice that just like Ruby's double-quoted strings, HAML allows you to interpolate variable values. So we set up the movie instance variable on our controller. We can print out its title. We can print out its rating. We can say something about when it was released. What is all this strift time garbage? This is another example of me helping those who help themselves. There'll be plenty of things sprinkled through the code where you go, what's up with that? And the correct answer is Google it. Strift time is one of the functions that has come down through us from our forefathers who wrote the C standard library, but it provides different ways of formatting dates and making them look nice. Okay, I think you understand my philosophy. Okay, so that's a really simple view. So now that we know what the pieces are, let's understand how they get connected together. Well, I'll back up for one moment. One thing, what's absent from this view? All I showed you was some code to display some stuff. So there's two questions we haven't answered. One of them is, once the user is satisfied looking at that stuff, what else can they do? Because there's nothing in the view that I showed you that provides a place where the user could, click. Of course, they could click the back button in their browser, but that's cheesy. And we also haven't answered how exactly did the user get to this page. So we'll kind of take these things one at a time. So let's start with how we got here. Here's a table that you may have seen before. If you haven't seen it, you haven't been reading the book, so read it. But just like the routing subsystem allows you to map HTTP methods and URIs to different controller actions, that same routing subsystem also sets up these helpful methods that will generate the routes for you in the context of a page. So what does that mean? It means that, for example, when we're looking at the list of all movies, index.html.haml, somewhere on that page, there will be a link to whose argument is movie path with an argument. Okay? What is movie path? It is the helper that gets set up for you that gives you back a route to the show action for that movie ID. So when the user clicks on it, the URI that's going to be generated is going to be movie/whatever the ID was with the get method because it's a link. From there, okay, so that's what it's going to look like in the actual HTML. From there, once that URI hits us, we already did this at 2 segments ago, that's going to get looked up in the routing subsystem, which will say, aha, /movie/something matches the show action of the movies controller, and I'll take the wildcard thing, ID, and I'll shove that into the params hash, or the params quacks like a hash. Okay? And with that, we can now call the appropriate controller action, and the controller action can reasonably expect to find that params:ID will be whatever this route said that it should match. Right? So this is how the routing system kind of acts as the glue between you and the outside world. You specify what you want the wildcards and other pieces of your routes to be, and the routing subsystem will make sure that they show up in the right place in the params hash, and then you can just kind of use them. Okay, so that's how we got here. What else can we do from that page? I didn't really put anything that the user could click on to get away from that page. Well, one thing is we could let the user return to the list of all movies. So how might we do that? Suppose we wanted to add a little strip of markup to the page that I showed so that you can click on something to go back to the movie list. And happily, those same URI helpers, here's that table again, RESTful URI helpers to the rescue, right? So what is the list of all movies? Well, that's just the index action for CRUD. And this is the URI we need to generate. And here is a helper that was created for us that will generate the URI. So if I just say movies path with no arguments, that will link us to the index action, and that will give us something like this, right? So the line that I would add to the show template is link to the back to list is the text that the user will see that's clickable, and movies path is a method call. Remember, we're in poetry mode again. We could have said movies path with empty parens, but why waste perfectly good parens in these difficult economic times? The movies path helper will generate the URI for us. Now, for a lot of people coming into Rails, and especially when you're dealing with these really simple apps, a perfectly understandable reaction is, why don't you just put why don't you just put /movies in quotes here? Why do you have to call a method to get back this really simple URI? And indeed, when you're only dealing with a really simple toy app like we're doing now, that's a legitimate concern. It doesn't seem like movies path is really saving you anything over just putting /movies in there as a string literal. However, what we will see is that as your models get more complicated, you'll find that what you actually want to say is, I want to go to the screen for the review of that movie written by that moviegoer. And that's a much more hairy URL. Or you could just say moviegoer movie review path with an argument, and the right thing will happen. So as with so many other Rails mechanisms, it seems like in some cases the simple case might be a little bit overkill, but stick with us, because the reason to do it this way is that as your app gets more complicated, these mechanisms scale very nicely, and they save you from some complexity.